Well, it's not a secret that it's back to school time, and that always brings back memories of when I was a young girl for me. Now, I didn't grow up in a family that had a lot of money for extras. We always had the necessities of life, but there wasn't much left over for extravagances. So when my mother would announce one morning in midsummer that this was the day when we would go shopping for school clothes, it was a big deal, a huge deal for my two sisters and me. The first stop would be Sears or maybe J.C. Penney or, remember, Montgomery Ward, where each of us got to pick out two outfits: sensible, serviceable, moderately priced. And when we had made our selections, Mother would carry them to the sales counter and put them on layaway. For those of you who are too young to know what layaway is, you would make a small down payment on whatever you were buying and then pay for it in installments over a certain period of time, a few months or a few weeks or whatever. It was like using a credit card without the hassle of a credit check. After all, the merchant still had the merchandise until you had made your final payment, and then whatever it was yours at last and you could take it home. Putting something on layaway was like a promise. You promised to pay for it, and the merchant promised not to sell it to anybody else if you made your payments on time. You had to wait for those promises to come true. Well, after that, we would head to the fabric store, back in the days when fabric was not $15 a yard. With 3 girls to dress, my mom was quite a good seamstress, so that's where most of our clothes came from. We would spend most of the afternoon just poring over pattern books and feeling the fabrics and thinking about what it might look like when it was made up into a dress or a coat or a jacket or pants or shirt. Finally, after getting Mother's approval, we would make our selections and have the fabric cut. We'd take the various pieces home with us, but then we would have to wait to see our visions turned into realities. After all, our mom was a farm wife, and sewing was only one thing on a very long list of things she had to do every day, especially in summer. But there was a promise implied when she helped us make our picks. Someday, our hopes, our dreams would be made real. Oh, it was hard to wait sometimes. I would see my sisters trying on their new dresses or their new pants or their new shirts, and I'd wonder when my turn would come. At 7 or 8 or 9, waiting seemed like an eternity. But there was a process, a method behind my mother's work, and waiting patiently, well, and sometimes not so patiently, that was my part in the process. And then one day, I would come in from running wild on the farm all day long, and there on the bed it would be, my new dress that I had already dreamed about wearing on the first day of school, completely finished, neatly pressed, ready to go, just as I imagined. The promise had finally been realized. Now, if waiting for a new dress was that hard for a little girl, imagine how hard it must have been for Abraham and Sarah as they waited decades for the promise God had made them to come to fruition. Abraham, before God changed his name, is a relatively young man when God first promises him a homeland and descendants more numerous than the stars. Go from your father's house to a land I will show you, God says. And so Abraham packs up and he goes. And when he gets there, he finds that that land is already full of people who are not real excited about having him settle among them. So he and Sarah pack up again, and they keep on going to Egypt. Remember Egypt? And there he tries to pass her off as his sister, because she's very beautiful. And Pharaoh has kind of taken a liking to her. And before things are all over, Pharaoh takes her as his wife before he finds out that she's really Abraham's. And things happen. Lots of things happen. They meet up with Lot. They keep going. More things happen. All kinds of things happen before eventually they get to that land that God had promised them years before. You can read all about it starting in Genesis 12 if you're curious. Yes, all kinds of things, good and bad and indifferent and who knows what, happen along the way, but no children, no descendants, at least not for Abraham and Sarah together. Oh, God shows up every now and then to remind them about the promise, but you can understand how they might be wondering just what that promise really meant. What their part in the process of making it happen was supposed to be. You get it when they take things into their own hands and Abraham has a child with Sarah's serving woman. You understand why they decide on a distant kinsman as their heir when the possibility of either of them having children seems long past. No wonder Sarah laughs when 3 men show up at that point and repeat the promise of innumerable descendants one more time. That's only human. But here's what's interesting to me about all of that. Even in the midst of this very long wait, even when trouble comes, even when they think that maybe they have failed somehow, Abraham and Sarah don't give up on the idea that God is with them, that God has a purpose for them, that God is on their side. They trust that God is with them in the process of whatever it is that is slowly becoming. Even if their vision of the promise itself grows a little shaky, their faith in the God whose promise it is does not. And that, the writer of Hebrews says, was accounted as righteousness to them. Faith is the evidence of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen, that writer also says. Now, before you get really excited, that doesn't mean that if we pray for a hypothetical pony, we're going to get it. It doesn't even mean that we will escape hard times and trouble and suffering if we somehow have just enough faith, whatever that might mean. What it does mean is that we can trust the God we cannot see to be with us as we move toward the things that God has promised, even when the way seems a little long, a little hard, a little murky before us. If you were here last week, you heard Pastor Leah speak about a big promise that God makes to us, about how things will be when all that exists comes to perfection, comes to completion at the end of time. Reading from the 21st chapter of the Revelation to John, she described a city where all of us from every nation live together. A city where justice and peace embrace, and God is in our very midst. In that city, there's a river that flows from God's own throne, and on either side of that river is the tree of life, whose leaves are for the healing of the nations. It's a grand and glorious vision, something that lifts the heart and gives release to the soul. It's a promise worth living toward, a promise that can fill us up when our hearts are broken and the way seems harder than we could ever imagine. We are living in a time when it can be hard to see even the briefest glimpse of that shining city and that day of peace it heralds. With so much hate and violence and fear-mongering ever before our eyes and ringing in our ears, even moving through one day to the next sometimes seems more than we can bear. I know it is for me. And I know how many of you have come to talk with Pastor Leah and me about that. We are in the waiting, in the depths of the process of becoming, the process that will, as the time matures and ripens, lead us to the fullness of the promise. Here's what we need to remember as we wait, as we live through this time. We are not alone. God is already in our midst, even when our eyes cannot yet glimpse God's unfailing light. We do not struggle alone, for God is here, and God's love is holding us now and forever. And God has given us each other, so that when I forget, you can remind me. And I'll remind you when the vision starts to fade. Remembering that God is with us, that God has given us to one another, holding on to that gives us strength and purpose so that even in the midst of these challenging times, we can and will continue to do the work God calls us to, bearing one another's burdens, giving of ourselves, and sharing the light of God's love with all we meet, seeking to be a blessing wherever we go. That's good work, friends. Oh, thanks be to God for God's abiding presence and unfailing love that gives us hope and fills our hearts with courage. Amen.